There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We dragged them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. Beatrix Dane now knows the horrifying truth. Her mother was a prisoner in Blackwood Manor, but the secrets of the house run deeper than a single locked room. A sorrowful cry from the darkness below is about to lead her to the curse's true source. The discovery of the words scratched into the wall of her mother's prison had irrevocably changed Beatrix. The timid, lonely girl who had sought refuge in books and daydreams was gone, burned away by the righteous, white-hot fury of the truth. In her place stood a young woman with eyes of cold, hard flint, a woman who now walked the halls of Blackwood Manor not as its prisoner, but as its judge. The house, which she had once feared, she now hated. It was a witness, an accomplice, a tomb that had held her mother's living body and now held the secrets of her demise. Her father had become a stranger to her, a monster hiding behind a mask of grief. She looked at him now across the long, silent dining table and saw not a stern, sorrowful parent, but a jailer, a tormentor. She studied the lines of his face, the coldness in his eyes, the thin, cruel set of his mouth, and she wondered what other horrors he was capable of. The house was no longer a place of quiet, oppressive sadness. It was a place of active, malevolent evil, and he was its master. The knowledge was a poison in her veins, but it was also a strange and terrible kind of strength. Fear had been replaced by a cold, sharp-edged anger that gave her a clarity she had never known. In the days that followed the revelation, the atmosphere in the manor grew even more tense. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged with unspoken accusations. Every time she and her father were in the same room, the air crackled with a silent, simmering war. He refused to meet her gaze, his eyes constantly shifting, filled with a guilt so profound it was almost a physical presence. He knew that she knew. The lie that had been the foundation of their relationship for 17 years was shattered, and they were left with nothing but the jagged, ugly pieces of the truth. But the house itself was not finished with her. Its secrets, she was beginning to understand, were layered like the skins of an onion, and the shadow's revelation of the scratched wall was only the peeling of the first, outer layer. The house, having been awakened by her knowledge, was now in a state of constant, low-level supernatural activity. It was as if her discovery had stirred the stagnant, sleeping spirits within its walls. She would hear things constantly now: a soft footfall in an empty corridor, the rustle of a dress from a vacant room, a door creaking open or shut on a windless day. The house seemed to breathe around her, its ancient, stone lungs filled with the sighs and whispers of its long, miserable history. She no longer felt that she was being watched by a single, focused entity. Instead, she felt as if the entire house were watching her, its collective consciousness aware of her every move. The portraits of her ancestors seemed to follow her with their cold, dead eyes, their expressions a mixture of condemnation and a strange, spectral encouragement. She was one of them now, a Dane woman who knew the truth, and she felt as if their long-dead spirits were waiting to see what she would do, whether she would be another victim, or whether she would finally be their avenger. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only a descent into nightmares filled with images of her mother's terrified face and the sound of fingernails scraping against plaster. She would often wake up in the dead of night, her heart pounding, a cold sweat on her brow, convinced that someone was standing in her room, just beyond the edge of her bed. But there was never anyone there. The terror was becoming a part of her, a constant, low hum of fear beneath the surface of her anger. It was on one such night, about a week after her discovery, that a new sound introduced itself into the haunted symphony of the manor. She had woken abruptly from a nightmare, her body rigid, her ears ringing with a profound silence. The storm that had raged for days had passed, and the world outside was still and calm. The moon was high and full, a perfect silver disk in a cloudless, ink-black sky, and its light poured through her bedroom window, bathing the room in a cold, ghostly radiance. It was in this moment of absolute stillness, in the dead heart of the night, that she heard it. It was the sound of a woman crying. It was not a loud, theatrical wailing. It was a soft, suppressed, and utterly heartbreaking sound. The sound of a grief so deep and so hopeless that it had gone beyond the point of frantic sobbing. It was the sound of a soul that had given up all hope, a quiet, rhythmic weeping that was more devastating than any scream. The sound was faint, distant, but it was unmistakably human, and it was filled with an agony that made Beatrix's own heart ache in sympathy. She sat bolt upright in bed, her body tense, straining to hear, to place the source of the sound. Was it one of the servants, ill or heartbroken? Was it the wind, playing a cruel trick on her overwrought nerves? She slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold on the polished floorboards, and crept to her door. She opened it a crack and listened. The sound was clearer in the hallway, echoing faintly in the vast, empty space of the manor. It was real. It was not her imagination. Someone or something in this house was weeping as if its heart were broken beyond all repair. A cold finger of fear traced its way down her spine, but it was followed by a wave of that new, hard anger. This was her mother's grief. She knew it with an instinct that was deeper than thought. This was the sound of her mother's despair, an emotional echo, a memory of pain trapped within the walls of this house, replaying itself over and over again in the dead of night. The sound was a clue, another piece of the puzzle. It was a thread, and she knew she had to follow it. She moved out into the corridor, a solitary figure in her white nightdress, bathed in the spectral, silvery moonlight. She did not bother with a candle. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and dance at the edge of her vision. She moved through the sleeping house, a ghost in her own right, her senses focused entirely on the faint, heartbreaking sound of the weeping. She was the only one who could hear it, the only one who was meant to hear it. It was a summons, meant for her alone. And as she followed the sound, her anger and her sorrow began to merge into a single powerful emotion. A desperate, profound need to find the source of that pain, to comfort the weeping spirit, and to bring its suffering, and her own, to an end. The house was crying, and she was going to find out why. The sound of weeping was a fragile, silver thread of sorrow, pulling Beatrix through the sleeping, moon-drenched labyrinth of Blackwood Manor. She moved with a stealth she didn't know she possessed, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors and thick, oriental rugs. The house, under the spectral light of the full moon, was transformed. The familiar hallways and grand chambers of her daily life had become an alien landscape, a place of sharp, menacing angles and deep, deceptive shadows. The moonlight, pouring through the tall, arched windows, was not a gentle, comforting light. It was a stark, inquisitorial glare that seemed to strip away the house's daytime mask, revealing the cold, dead bones beneath. As she moved, she listened with an intensity that was almost painful, trying to pinpoint the source of the heartbreaking sound. The weeping was a constant, low, rhythmic sobbing, a sound of utter, hopeless despair. At first, she thought it might be coming from one of the many empty guest bedrooms, or perhaps from her father's chambers in the West Wing. But as she crept closer to the grand central staircase, she realized she was wrong. The sound was not coming from the upper floors. It seemed to be rising from below, a sorrowful exhalation from the very foundations of the manor. It was seeping up through the floorboards, a ghostly lament from the dark, forgotten underbelly of the house. The sound was coming from the cellar. A fresh wave of cold fear washed over her. The cellar. It was a part of the house that was as foreign to her as a distant land. It was a place of darkness and secrets, a domain she had been forbidden to enter for her entire life. When she was a child, the servants had filled her head with stories of the manor's cellars, that they were a confusing maze of tunnels, that they were filled with rats and spiders, that the ghosts of long-dead Danes roamed their cold, damp corridors. Her father had reinforced this fear, telling her that the cellars were structurally unsafe, that it was for her own protection that she was never to go down there. But now, she knew his warnings were not born of a concern for her safety. They were born of a desperate need to protect his secrets. The cellar was not just a place for storing wine and old furniture. It was a place for hiding things. And the sound of the weeping, now growing ever so slightly louder, told her that it was a place for hiding people. Her path was now clear. She descended the grand staircase, the moonlight creating a ghostly, striped pattern on the steps. She moved across the great hall, a small, solitary figure in white, passing the looming, silent portraits of her ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to watch her, their expressions a mixture of stern disapproval and a strange, spectral urgency, as if they were both condemning her for breaking the rules and willing her forward to uncover the truth. She reached the back of the hall, where a narrow, unassuming corridor led to the servants' quarters and the kitchens. Tucked away in an alcove at the end of this corridor was a single, heavy door. It was made of thick, dark oak, banded with strips of black, rusted iron. This was the cellar door. She had passed it 1,000 times in her life, but had never paid it any mind. It was simply a part of the house that was off limits. Now, it seemed like the most significant door in the entire manor. It was a gateway to the unknown, a portal to the source of her mother's sand, the house sorrow. As she stood before it, the sound of the weeping was clearer, more distinct. It was still muffled by the thick wood of the door, but the heartbreak in it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a soul that had been utterly, completely broken. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the large, cold iron ring that served as a handle. The childish fears, so carefully instilled in her over the years, rose up. The darkness, the rats, the ghosts. But then she thought of her mother, of the words scratched into the wall, of the terrified face in the mirror. Her fear was eclipsed by her cold, hard anger, and by a profound, aching pity for the weeping spirit that was calling to her. She felt a strange, new sensation, the same unseen, psychic pressure she had felt in the library. It was a gentle but insistent nudge, a feeling that she was not acting entirely of her own volition. It was as if an invisible hand were guiding her, the will of her mother's spirit, perhaps, or the will of the house itself, compelling her to complete this journey. It wanted her to know. It needed her to know. The secrets of the house were ready to be revealed, and she was the chosen key. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she closed her hand around the cold iron ring. It was icy to the touch, and the chill seemed to seep directly into her bones. She pulled. The heavy door resisted for a moment, and then, with a low, groaning complaint of old, dry hinges, it swung inward, opening a square of absolute, profound blackness before her. She had breached the forbidden territory. She was now on a path from which there could be no return. The house had opened its heart to her, and she knew that what she found in its depths would either save her, or destroy her completely. The moment the cellar door swung open, a wave of cold, stagnant air rushed up from the darkness to greet Beatrix. It was a physical assault on her senses. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the smells of a place that had been sealed off from the living world for generations. It was a complex and horrifying bouquet of scents. The deep, earthy smell of damp soil and wet stone, the sharp, pungent aroma of mildew and rot, and underneath it all, a faint, metallic tang, like old, dried blood. The cold was not the clean, sharp cold of a winter's night, but a damp, clinging chill that seemed to promise sickness and decay. It was the cold of the grave, and it sank into her thin nightdress, making her shiver with a sudden, violent intensity. She stood on the threshold, peering down into a square of absolute, impenetrable blackness. The sound of the woman's weeping was clearer now, rising up from the depths, a sorrowful, ghostly siren song luring her into the abyss. She needed light. Retreating for a moment, she found a single, forgotten candle in a holder in the servants' corridor. Her hands trembled as she lit it, the small, sputtering flame looking fragile and hopelessly inadequate against the profound darkness she was about to face. Shielding the flame with her hand, she returned to the open doorway and took the first, tentative step down. The stone steps were steep, narrow, and treacherous. They were slick with a fine, slimy moisture that seemed to weep from the very walls, and she had to place her bare feet carefully to keep from slipping. With every step she took, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thicker, heavier. The door at the top of the stairs swung shut behind her with a deep, echoing thud, the sound of a tomb being sealed. The last of the pale moonlight was cut off, and she was plunged into a world that consisted only of the small, dancing circle of her candlelight and the vast, oppressive darkness that surrounded it. The weeping sound was her only guide. It seemed to be coming from the deepest part of the cellar, and she followed it, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a vast, cavernous space. The cellar was not a single room, but a confusing, disorienting labyrinth of low, vaulted stone archways and winding passages. It was a maze designed to confuse and entrap. The floor was uneven, a mixture of packed earth and rough, broken flagstones. All around her, hulking, monstrous shapes loomed in the darkness, shrouded in thick, white dust cloths. They were the discarded relics of the Dane family's past piles of broken furniture, stacks of rotting trunks, portraits of ancestors whose faces had been eaten away by damp and time. The cobwebs here were ancient and thick, hanging from the ceiling in great, gray sheets that brushed against her face and hair like the touch of dead fingers. The sound of the weeping seemed to echo strangely in this subterranean space. It no longer came from a single, clear direction. The stone archways and narrow passages seemed to throw the sound back and forth, making it seem as if it were coming from all directions at once. One moment, it would be a whisper directly in front of her. The next, a sob from somewhere deep behind her. It was a disorienting, maddening effect, as if the spirit itself were a part of the maze, leading her deeper and deeper into the confusion and the darkness. She pressed on, driven by that strange external compulsion and her own cold, hard anger. She navigated the labyrinth of shadows, her small candle flame casting her own shadow as a huge, monstrous, and distorted figure that danced and writhed on the stone walls around her. She felt as if she were descending into the underworld, on a quest to find a lost soul. The air was thick with a sense of profound, ancient sorrow. This was not just a place for storage, it was a place of banishment, a place where unwanted things and perhaps unwanted people were sent to be forgotten. She could feel the weight of generations of secrets pressing down on her from the low, stone ceiling. After what felt like an eternity of wandering through the cold, dark maze, she turned a corner and saw that the nature of her path had changed. She was in a long, narrow, and straight corridor, its walls more smoothly finished than the rough-hewn stone of the rest of the cellar. This section felt different, more deliberate, and at the very end of this corridor was a single door. The weeping was loudest here. It was coming from directly behind that door. As she drew closer, she saw that this door was unlike any other she had seen in the manor. It was not made of wood. It was a heavy, solid slab of black iron, its surface pitted with rust. A series of thick, heavy bolts were set into the stone frame around it, suggesting it could be locked and barred from the outside. In the center of the door was a small, grated window, like the kind one might find on a prison cell. This was not a door to a wine cellar or a storage room. This was the door to a dungeon, a cell. The most chilling detail, however, was that the door was not locked. The heavy bolts were thrown back, and the door was standing slightly ajar, a thin, vertical sliver of blackness separating it from the frame. The weeping sound poured through this small opening, raw and unfiltered. But it was not the only thing that came through the gap. A thin sliver of pale, flickering light was also visible, a sign that there was a source of illumination, however weak, within the sealed-off room. It was an unnatural light, a light that had no business being in a windowless cell deep beneath the earth. Beatrix stood before the iron door, her quest at its end. The source of the crying, the heart of the house's sorrow, lay just a few feet away. The fear that she had been holding at bay now returned with a vengeance. A cold, sickening wave of pure dread. What lay behind that door? What kind of room required a solid iron door and a prison-like grate? And what was the source of that strange, flickering light? Her hand, holding the candle, trembled so violently that the flame threatened to extinguish itself, which would leave her trapped in the absolute darkness of the labyrinth. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had come this far. She could not turn back now. The weeping from within the room seemed to rise in intensity, as if the spirit knew she was there, as if it were pleading with her to enter, to bear witness to its eternal torment. Placing her candle on the damp floor, she reached out with both hands and placed them on the cold, rough surface of the iron door. It was icy to the touch, a profound, grave-like cold that seemed to suck the very warmth from her fingertips. With a final, silent prayer to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, she pushed. The heavy door moved with a low, grinding shriek of rusted, protesting hinges. The opening widened, and the strange, pale light from within spilled out into the corridor, casting her own terrified form in a long, dark silhouette. The weeping sound suddenly stopped. She had arrived, and now she had to face what was inside. The heavy iron door groaned open, its screeching protest echoing down the long, dark corridor behind Beatrix before finally dying out into a profound and ringing silence. The sound of the weeping, which had been her constant, sorrowful guide, had abruptly ceased the moment she touched the door. The sudden absence of the sound was more unnerving than the sound itself. It was a silence of anticipation, the held breath of a trapped spirit that knew its long, lonely vigil was about to be disturbed. Beatrix stood on the threshold, her own heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs, as she peered into the strange, flickering light of the room beyond. She took a hesitant step inside, and the world fractured into a dizzying, terrifying infinity. The room was small, square, and windowless, a perfect, stone-lined cube deep in the earth. But its oppressive, claustrophobic nature was amplified 1,000 times over by what covered the walls. From the damp stone floor to the low, vaulted ceiling, every inch of the four walls was covered in mirrors. They were mirrors of all shapes and all sizes, a chaotic, mismatched mosaic of looking glasses. There were large, ornate, gilt-framed mirrors, their gold leaf tarnished and peeling. There were small, simple, oval-shaped mirrors. There were long, rectangular pier glasses that stretched from floor to ceiling. They were all old, their reflective silvering spotted and clouded with age, like the cataract eyes of the dead. In the exact center of the room, on a small, crude wooden stool, sat a single, thick candle, its guttering, sputtering flame providing the only source of light. The moment Beatrix stepped into the room, her own image was captured and multiplied into a horrifying, endless army of herself. She was everywhere. 1,000 Beatrixes stared back at her from every conceivable angle. To her left, a tall, thin Beatrix with a gaunt, skeletal face. To her right, a short, wide Beatrix, her form grotesquely compressed. Above her, 100 smaller versions of her face stared down, their expressions a mixture of terror and confusion. The reflections were not perfect. The old, flawed glass of the mirrors distorted her image, stretching and twisting her form into monstrous caricatures. It was a chamber of madness, a room specifically designed to shatter a person's sense of self, to make them lose all sense of what was real and what was a reflection. She felt a wave of vertigo so powerful that she had to press a hand against the cold stone of the doorframe to steady herself. The room seemed to spin, the thousand reflections of herself and the flickering candle flame creating a dizzying, nauseating kaleidoscope of light and movement. This was not a room. This was a torture chamber. This was her mother's final prison cell. The scratches on the bedroom wall had been a testament to a physical imprisonment. But this was a prison for the mind. She imagined her mother, locked in this windowless cube, with nothing but a single candle and 1,000 broken, distorted versions of her own despairing face for company. It was a cruelty so profound, so sadistic, that it took her breath away. Her father had not just locked his wife away. He had tried to systematically unmake her, to drive her into a madness from which there could be no escape. And it was in that moment of horrified understanding that the true haunting began. The crying had stopped, but the spirit was not gone. It had simply been waiting for its audience. As Beatrix stared, her mind reeling, a new figure began to appear in the mirrors. It was not her own reflection. In every single one of the 1,000 mirrors, in the space just behind her own multiplied image, a new form was coalescing. It was the faint, translucent, and shimmering figure of a woman. It was her mother. The ghost was not in the room with her. It was in the mirrors. Each mirror held a perfect, spectral copy of her. 1,000 weeping ghosts trapped in 1,000 glass prisons. The apparition was just as Beatrix had seen it in her bedroom mirror. But here, its sorrow was amplified by its endless repetition. The woman's form was pale and luminous, her dark hair flowing around a face of exquisite, heartbreaking beauty. But her face was a mask of eternal, unending grief. Her spectral shoulders were slumped in defeat, and she was weeping. There was no sound, but Beatrix could see the silent tears tracing paths down her ghostly cheeks. She could see the profound, soul-deep agony in her eyes. The room, which had been silent, was now filled with the deafening, silent scream of 1,000 weeping ghosts, each one a perfect echo of a single, shattered soul. Beatrix felt a cry of pure, empathetic pain rise in her own throat. "Mother," she whispered, the word a fragile breath in the cold, still air. As if in response to her voice, the 1,000 ghostly figures looked up. Their sad, weeping eyes, multiplied to infinity, all focused on her. It was a gaze of such intense, desperate longing that it felt like a physical touch. It was the gaze of a mother who had been separated from her child, a prisoner who was seeing her only hope of salvation. But as Beatrix looked closer, she saw that the ghosts were not just looking at her. They were looking at something behind her. A new wave of cold fear, sharper and more immediate than any she had yet felt, washed over her. She was not alone with the ghosts of her mother. There was something else in the room. Slowly, her own 1,000 reflections began to part, as if pushed aside by an unseen presence. And in the mirrors, in the space behind the weeping, spectral forms of her mother, a new figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was a tall, man-shaped silhouette, a being of pure, featureless, and absolute blackness. The Shadow Man. It was standing behind her mother in every single one of the 1,000 reflections. It was a dark, silent guardian, its form a stark and terrifying contrast to the pale, sorrowful light of the ghost. Its presence was one of complete and utter domination. The ghost of her mother was not just a restless spirit haunting the place of her suffering. She was a prisoner, and the Shadow Man was her eternal jailer. The horrifying truth of the curse, of the house, of her family's entire legacy, was now laid bare. It was a story of a cruel, sadistic imprisonment, an act of such profound evil that it had created two distinct supernatural entities. The first was the ghost of the victim, her mother, her soul so fractured by the torment that it was now trapped, endlessly weeping, in the very mirrors that had been used to destroy her mind. The second was the ghost of the crime itself, the concentrated, malevolent will of the tormentor, a living shadow that stood a perpetual, silent guard over its prisoner. The weeping ghost, her mother, raised a single, translucent hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass in every mirror. It was a gesture of desperate pleading, and her lips moved, forming a silent word, the same word she had mouthed in the bedroom mirror, but now it was repeated 1,000 times, a silent, echoing scream that filled the room. Trapped. Beatrix now understood everything. The crying she had heard was not just a memory. It was a lure. It was the desperate, sorrowful call of a trapped spirit, a call that only its own blood, its own daughter, could hear. It was a cry for help, a plea to be set free, not just from the mirrors, but from the dark, silent guardian that would never, ever let her go. Rick stared at the 1,000-fold horror before her, the weeping prisoner and her shadowy keeper, and she knew that the house had finally shown her its deepest, most terrible secret. She was standing in the very heart of the curse, a curse made not of magic, but of human cruelty so profound it had stained the very fabric of reality. The horrifying tableau held an eternal, silent scream trapped in 1,000 mirrors. The weeping ghost of her mother, her face a mask of endless sorrow, pressed against the glass, her silent plea trapid echoing in the dizzying infinity of reflections. And behind her, in every mirror, stood the dark, silent, and absolute form of the Shadow Man, her eternal keeper. In that single, terrible moment, the entire, twisted truth of Blackwood Manor was laid bare before Beatrix. The final, most deeply buried layer of the secret had been revealed. This small, cold, windowless room deep in the earth was the heart of the curse. It was the source of all the sorrow that saturated the very stones of the house. This was her mother's final prison. The scratched-up room upstairs had been a cage, but this was a torture chamber. She tried to imagine the horror of it, to be locked away from the sun, from the world, from her own child, in a black, stone box, and then to have a single candle lit, only to be confronted with 1,000 broken, distorted images of her own despairing face, a constant, mocking reminder of her own fracturing sanity. It was a cruelty so refined, so diabolical, that it could only have been conceived by a mind of pure, cold sadism. This was what her father had done. He had not just imprisoned his wife's body. He had systematically, and with monstrous patience, set out to destroy her mind. And now, Beatrix finally understood the true nature of the haunting. It was not a simple ghost story. It was a complex, layered tragedy, an act of evil so profound that it had permanently scarred the fabric of reality. The crying she had heard, the sorrowful weeping that had led her down into this dark, forgotten place, was a memory. It was an emotional echo, a psychic stain left behind by the sheer, overwhelming force of her mother's grief. It was the pain of the house itself, endlessly replaying the sorrow of its greatest victim. A memory so powerful it had become a sound, a lure, a call to the one person who might understand. But the vision in the mirrors was not a memory. It was a present, ongoing horror. The weeping ghost of her mother was a real, trapped, and conscious spirit. Her soul, shattered by the torment of this mirrored cell, had become imprisoned within the very objects of its torture. She was literally a prisoner in the looking glasses, her spirit bound to the place of her greatest suffering. And she was not alone. The Shadow Man, the dark, featureless silhouette that stood a silent, eternal guard behind her in every reflection, was the other half of the curse. It was the lingering, malevolent will of the tormentor, the spiritual embodiment of her father's cruelty and control. It was a sentient shadow born from an act of pure evil, its only purpose to ensure that its prisoner could never, ever escape. The curse of the Dane family was not a mystical hex passed down through the bloodline. It was a prison, built by one generation to contain a victim, and the haunting was the eternal struggle between the prisoner and the guard. The house was their battleground, and Beatrix, by discovering the truth, had just become a soldier in their endless, spectral war. She stood there, frozen, the 1,000 reflections of the weeping mother and the watchful shadow swimming before her eyes. The urge to flee, to run screaming from this room of madness, was a powerful physical thing. But she could not move. She was held fast by the desperate, pleading gaze of her mother's 1,000 eyes. They were begging her for help, for release, for an end to the torment. What could she do? The thought was a frantic, hopeless scream in her own mind. Smash the mirrors? Would that free the spirit? Or would it simply shatter her soul into 1,000 weeping fragments? Or worse, destroy it completely? Confront her father? What could she say? I found my mother's ghost, trapped in a mirrored cell you built in the cellar? He would call her mad, hysterical, the same words he had likely used to condemn his wife. He might even decide that she, too, needed to be cared for in a place of quiet reflection. The thought sent a jolt of pure, icy terror through her. The ghost in the mirrors seemed to sense her fear and her indecision. Its 1,000 faces filled with a new, even more desperate urgency. It pulled its hand back from the glass and began to make a new gesture. Pointed, but it did not point at Beatrix or at the door. In every mirror, the translucent, sorrowful finger of her mother's ghost was pointing at the only other entity in the reflection. It was pointing directly at the dark, silent, and imposing figure of the Shadow Man that stood behind it. The meaning was chillingly clear. Her mother was not just asking for freedom. She was identifying her jailer. She was telling Beatrix that the shadow was the key. It was the source of her imprisonment. It was the true enemy. To free the prisoner, she would have to defeat the guard. As if angered by this act of spectral defiance, the Shadow Man seemed to react. The deep, inky blackness of its form seemed to intensify, to grow darker, more solid. The cold in the room dropped even further, and a low, humming sound began to fill the air, a sound of pure, vibrational menace. The thousand reflections of her mother flinched, their forms wavering and shrinking back, their silent weeping turning into a silent scream of pure terror. The shadow was asserting its power, reminding its prisoner of its absolute, eternal control. Beatrix knew she had to get out. To stay here any longer would be to risk her own sanity, to be consumed by the raw, supernatural conflict that was unfolding in the mirrors. With a final, heartbreaking look at her mother's terrified, pleading face, a silent promise passing between them, she turned. She stumbled back through the heavy iron door, pulling it shut behind her. The heavy thud as it closed echoed in the cellar, sealing the terrible vision away. She did not wait to retrieve her candle. She ran. She fled through the dark, confusing labyrinth of the cellar, her bare feet slapping against the cold, damp stone, her only guide the faint memory of the path she had taken. She scrambled up the slick, stone steps, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She burst through the cellar door into the moonlit hallway of the manor, slamming the door shut behind her and leaning against it, her body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She was safe for now, but the image of the mirrored room, of the thousand weeping ghosts and their single, shadowy keeper, was burned forever into her mind. She had found the source of the manor's sorrow, the heart of the curse. It was not a thing of the past. It was a present, ongoing torment. And she, Beatrix Dane, was the only living soul who knew the truth. The house was not just haunted by a sad memory. It was the site of an eternal struggle, and she had just been recruited, by a ghost's desperate plea, to be its champion. Her life of quiet, lonely fear was over. A new life, a life of terrifying, dangerous purpose, had just begun. Beatrix has found the source of the manor's sorrow, a secret, mirrored cell designed for torture. The house is not just haunted by a ghost. It is haunted by the very act of its cruelty. The curse is not a hex, but a prison of reflections. Who is the weeping ghost in the mirrors? Is it truly her mother, or something else? And what is the shadow that stands guard over her? Share your theories below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.